Okay, so let's pick up from where we left off last week. Uh, this, by the way, is the pre-recorded Camtasia presentation that I promised, and it'll appear in all future lecture formats, and then we'll meet during the scheduled webinar just for questions and answers and general feedback. I may also have some other informal things to show you different data and research projects and other things that I've worked on, which may prove interesting to you. But at any rate, we left off on in field experiments, and as you can see here in the graphic, it's a fairly common research approach, one that's used quite often in social psychology. A lot of social cognition from Bandura, Albert Bandura, was developed through uh, field research and working with Confederates. I've prepared here an interesting experiment that was done. I, in fact, would like to continue doing this with ethnic and racial experiments instead of just dress, just to demonstrate different types of prejudice or racism in different parts of the country and indeed in different demographics, even within the same city. Excuse me. But in this particular experiment, the researcher looked at customer service as a function of shoppers' attire. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I think you can read it yourself. But as you can see, the independent variable, that is the variable that is changed, the thing that's manipulated by the experimenter, is the female Confederate's dress, either formal or informal. And the dependent variable is time. We wanted to determine the amount of time that it would take for the sales clerk to approach the customer. So the procedure at the bottom was the Confederates enter randomly selected women's stores between certain times on 2 consecutive Thursdays. So some they did try to maintain some kind of randomness. Their women's stores were randomly selected. I don't know which ones they were and the time, and it was on Thursdays. So again, you can see here the time it took, and here are the results of that. It took on a, with the Confederate wearing formal clothing, approximately 50 seconds to approach the Confederate, and with informal clothing, it took the clerk over 70 seconds to approach the Confederate. Notice here also that upon entering the store, the female Confederate activated a stopwatch and so on and so forth. And then she stopped the stopwatch when the employee approached and spoke to her. Now, as opposed to field experiments, we have genuine lab experiments, experiments that are conducted within a laboratory setting that is confined. You've seen probably many experiments like this just in movies. The movie that you'll watch, Experimenter, is all conducted within a laboratory setting as well. But this is a very controlled setting. And the problem, as I mentioned, and we'll talk more about something called internal and external validity, that the internal validity of the experiment is controlled. It's more valid. What is the internal validity? It is the amount of substance, the amount of credibility that you can give to the experiment in and of itself being credible. That is and what is credible in an experiment? It's that the independent variable caused the dependent variable to change. It was the causative factor. The problem is that it's less general. You can generalize it less to the environment. It's got less external validity. So when you possibly change settings, different settings other than the lab, different researchers, different participants, it may in fact not render the same types of results. Here's an experiment, interesting that showed that and this was just done in 1996. By the way, in social psychology, there's all kinds of experiments done like this. But this demonstrates that vulnerable individuals under the right circumstances would confess to an act they did not commit and have memory of committing the act. Now, vulnerability in this case doesn't necessarily mean low self-esteem or feelings of guilt, but rather vulnerability in this sense was induced through rushing, through being timed, through pressure. So making them do something very fast makes them vulnerable, and at a moderate speed is more of a control. I'll let you read this as well, but generally the results indicated that individuals were more likely to confess to making a mistake that they had not made at all in a vulnerable condition, when a confederate or witness said that the research participant had indeed made the error. So we're looking at field. We looked at field experiments, looked at lab experiments. Let's talk about internet experiments. One thing that I like to do when teaching research methods, basic research methods to undergraduates, is to have them actually do internet experiments where they set up their own types of surveys using some material that I've used before. So they have to operate within certain boundaries, and that is that they use surveys and tests that are known and blessed, psychometrically speaking. So what's the advantages? Of course, obviously, common sense would tell you that you've got access to a diverse population and you can bring the participant to the experiment to the participant. Indeed, they're just simply more convenient to do and very inexpensive. The disadvantages is that you may get multiple submissions. Now, of course, there's some control that you can implement over multiple submissions, because in your survey, and Google Forms creates an excellent survey, or you can use SurveyMonkey, but it costs. You can make your own survey using Google Forms. You don't have as much control. There's a certain self-selection bias associated with it. And of course, your attrition rates are considerably higher. Then you have what's called non-experimental quantitative research, where you don't manipulate the independent variables. Now, these are also very valuable. And when I say non-experimental, what is experiment versus non-experimental? One of the major differences is that the experimenter doesn't have direct control over the independent variable. So instead, the experimenter collects the data, and this is sort of some of the data that I want to show you later, next week or Saturday, is that the experimenter collects the data and then analyzes it. This indeed is very popular research. This isn't qualitative research, it's quantitative research, but it's not experimental in that the experimenter doesn't have the ability to directly manipulate the variables. So some of these include correlational data, natural manipulation research, and cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Correlational studies are very popular. There are correlational studies that you can sort of ho-hum. Yeah, okay, well that's an excuse me, that's an interesting correlation. And there are others that are quite complex and elegant, sophisticated. I'd like to show you maybe one or two of those as well. And they're done with correlational software that's been developed recently, and it could only have been developed through the use of modern computers, because 40, 50 years ago, this type of data crunching could never have been done. So at any rate, these researchers were interested in the relationship between IQ scores of parents and IQ scores of their offspring, and they measured the IQ and correlated the two. These can be used for prediction. For example, in 2009, a study was done on the recidivism for sexual offenders, relapse and depression, recovery after mild traumatic brain injury, and so on and so forth. But they're done quite a bit. This is a study that I'll show you. We'll get into more detail on this particular study next week. And this is a study that I did, gathering a lot of data from one of the behavioral health HMOs that I consult for. And as you can see there on the bottom, the size of the group was 1,728. That's a considerable amount of data. That's another thing about correlational research, is that you can gather a lot of data that's been collected over a long period of time, or a longer period of time, versus the experiment that you conduct within a fairly short period of time. That type of research, the N is restricted, or size, the group sizes are restricted. So what's the primary limitation of correlational studies? Well, of course, you have an inability to a degree to determine causality. You have what's called the third variable problem. And that is, you can't fully explain how the independent variable, let's say variable A, affects the dependent variable, variable B. Now, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, in that you can often have several independent variables as well as several dependent variables, and all of those interact. So this idea that we in experiment that it's pure reductionism is not true. We first look at the problem by reducing it, and then thereafter we look at the relationships between the different variables. And again, that's something that I want to show you next week more informally, so that you can look at that and then we can comment on what's going on. This cartoon, of course, shows that the study found that Colorado has the lowest obesity level of any state, which is true, by the way. And then she says, well, do you know what that means? No, what? Forget dieting, we're moving to Colorado. In other words, being in Colorado is the causative, is causation for obesity. I mentioned to you more complex ways of showing interaction between variables. And for example here, and this is something I'm going to get into in more detail next Saturday, is path analysis, and another type of study of method called structural equation modeling. And that even goes even further into what's called Bayesian structural equation modeling. Where you could look at how independent variables and the dependent variables all interact with one another in real time. This is used quite a bit in web marketing, and it's used very effectively. So you can see here that there's three independent variables: the parent's education, their income, and their self-efficacy, and how they interact with one another, and then how they in turn affect dependent variables, including the beliefs and the parent-child relationship. And there is a reciprocity also between parent-child relationship and parenting beliefs. It shows only one direction, but in fact, there's two, or at least I believe there's two, which then shows child's mastery and child's development. This is something else that I'll get into next week. The Framingham study is a cross-sectional and longitudinal study. I'd suggest strongly that you go to the internet, go to Google, and look up the Framingham Heart Study. There's a tremendous amount of data there, some that in fact you may indeed find interesting and get some health tips about yourself. But this was an expensive, very expensive longitudinal study that assessed the same participants over a long period of time. And measured changes in IQ for some participants over several years, as well as, and this is one of the major parts of the study, is that it looked also at lifestyle and health, particularly uh, uh, cardiac problems. Then there's cohort sequential research. It's used a lot in educational research. I'll let you study this, but it looks at short periods of time, and then especially when we look at uh, child development, uh, because child development, you have such changes in such relatively short periods of time. Researchers are interested in well, what changes from, let's say, in this case, from the 7th to the 9th grade versus what changes from the 9th to the 11th grade. And so two specific cohorts are selected, and then they look at different dependent variables that change, in this particular case, academic motivation during adolescence, but there's many other developmental factors that change as well in fairly short periods of time. Then we look at qualitative data. I'm going to take a sip of coffee here. Qualitative data is an interpretive research approach. Notice that it is interpretive. So in and of the fact that it's interpretive, it includes a lot of potential bias, which may or may not be good or relevant. But it relies on multiple types of subjective data and investigates people in particular situations in their natural environment. So of course, investigating situations in their natural environment does give the experiment, makes the experiment more generalizable and gives it more external validity. But then again, the internal validity, that is the true relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, is up to question. That is, the causative agents are then up to question. So again, what are the weaknesses? Difficult to generalize findings, possible lack of agreement among researchers, which occurs quite often in qualitative research, and the objective hypothesis of testing is not used. So general hypothesis testing, that is whether or not to confirm whether a given question is indeed the causative factor, what we call hypothesis testing, or confirming or disconfirming the null hypothesis. Again, something you might want to look up on Google. We'll discuss that later as well. What are the strengths? Well, the description of individuals with common identity, and you can develop a theoretical understanding of phenomena. So what happens from qualitative data is that we can derive a lot of information and questions, and then move from qualitative data to quantitative experiments. So we get a lot of questions that are asked. So what are the values of qualitative data? Isn't so much that it solves questions, but generates questions that we can then go back and analyze. Some of the methods for data collection. Of course, one of the major methods of data collection is testing. And it's commonly used as a measure of personality or aptitude or achievement or performance. We're going to have a considerable chapter later concerning testing and the different types of test validity, whether you have face validity or concurrent validity or predictive validity or criterion validity or construct validity, these different types of validity and what they mean. But any test that we use has to come with information on reliability, validity, and norms. These are called psychometrics. So a good objective test has good psychometric criteria. What are the strengths of tests? You can read this yourself. Uh, One of the major strengths of tests, however, is that it provides hard quantitative data. The weakness of tests, they can be expensive, depending upon the types of tests that you're using. Many of the basic criteria for tests now come from the public domain. You really don't have to pay for them, but you have other problems as well, some of these issues. And again, as you read these items, we're going to try to get into more of these items in more detail in the future before the end of the semester, like reactivity of participants. Open-ended questions and probing isn't available, but then again, open-ended questions and probing generate certain confounds and extraneous variables that are more difficult to explain anyway. Tests are sometimes biased against certain groups of people. As you know, intelligence tests are indeed biased against certain demographics. You can get non-response to selected items on the test, and some tests, as I said, lack psychometric data, in which case you want to steer away from those. Questionnaires are often used. One of the strengths of questionnaires, and particularly when you use survey questionnaires on the internet, is that you can keep your subjects anonymous. Now later in the ethics part in chapter 4, we're going to talk about the difference between anonymity, privacy, and confidentiality. And anonymity, of course, is no one knows who you are at all. So this is a big strength of questionnaires, especially internet implemented questionnaires. Questionnaires, and this is something I run into, especially as a consultant for behavioral health, community services, and HMOs, is that questionnaires have to be kept short. People don't like taking tests, especially if they're presented with them as a quick survey. I'm sure you've run into this many times, especially with consumer information. Some Amazon or Walmart or whoever you may do shopping with may present you with a questionnaire concerning customer satisfaction. Please answer our questionnaire. And indeed, some of these companies will even offer some kind of a reward for your answering the questionnaire, some sort of an inducement. And quite frankly, most of the time I even pass that over. So they have to be kept very short. Usually the return rate that we get, the standard return rate that we get from an insurance company or a community health service is no greater than 20%. Or in other words, if you send out 100 questionnaires, you're only going to get about 20 back. And that's on a good day. So they have to be kept very short. The longer they are, the less likely people are going to respond to them. Reactivity of participants, such as social desirability, is also going to be heavier. In other words, as the questionnaire becomes more personal and confrontive, people respond to it. So, and you'll get even non-response to selective items. People, for example, some sensitive information, like, for example, were you abused as a child? And then when you get into questions regarding the type of abuse, or questions about alcoholism or drug use. So, and even if they're anonymous, there's a personal reactivity going on with it. People feel sort of a self-guilt about answering questions like that, even though they know that no one's going to know who they are or where they are or anything. Another type of data collection includes interviews. This is a situation where the interviewer asks an interviewee a series of questions. Clearly, the strengths of these is that they're good for measuring attitudes and most other content of interest, but some of the, and you can get into in-depth types of information. One of the problems with the interview technique is that the in-person interviews are not only expensive and time-consuming, but you'll have a reactivity of participants to the interviewee. So depending upon who the interviewer and the interviewee are, there's obviously going to be a reaction between the two. Also, the perceived anonymity by the respondent might be low. If you're interacting with somebody directly and then somebody you're sitting across from asks you some personal questions, you may indeed feel self-conscious or shameful about answering those questions. Then we have what are called focus groups. I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a focus group. These are done quite a bit with in marketing research. Focus group usually doesn't have more than 6 to 12 people. Focus groups, by the way, are also used in an area that I'm keenly interested in, which is online gaming and video gaming. I find video gaming, child that I am, very, very interesting. I spend probably, whenever I can, at least an hour or two a day at night, really, playing some kind of video game. And it's marvelous, some of these video games. It takes you out of yourself, and if you can be not a serious adult for a while, but just play a video game, you may very well find it indeed very relaxing and challenging. But focus groups are used a lot in video games in determining their interest and how they hold the participant. Some of these things, again, you can find on the internet. A lot of the types of focus groups, but mostly marketing, products, developing, especially in product development, they're used quite a bit. Their strengths allow for probing and examine how participants react to one another. Of course, a focus group is almost similar to group therapy, except that a group therapy is therapy and a focus group is research. So the two are similar in process, different in goal. You can read some of the weaknesses there, and of course they can be expensive. There's another factor that we haven't considered in both interview techniques as well as focus groups, and we'll consider that later when we get into, I think, Chapter 5, when we start talking about validity and reliability, and that is something called inter-rater reliability, and that is that the people who are implementing the focus group or conducting, that is, the focus group and the interviews, they all have to have the similar training so that they are asking the questions and responding in similar manners. So there needs to be a cross-training across all of them so that they're eliciting the same types of responses. Focus groups, again, the weaknesses, I'll let you go ahead and read that. As you should. And then going down, and by the way, you notice it in these methods of data collection, we've gone from methods of data collection where we're very fine-grained in quantitative data, going down into more naturalistic, more natural environments, from the true experiment down to non-experimental research. Where we're doing correlation but still using data, and then further down into internet research, surveys, interviews, focus groups, and now let's look at observation, naturalistic observation done in real-world settings. Of course, there's a picture of Jane Goodall there observing, and she spent decades observing chimpanzees in their natural environment. So these are done in real-world settings. She got a tremendous amount of data just observing chimpanzees in their natural environment, and yet still one must ask, is the data that she observed, is that the same as, say, another observer, or take 10 different observers spending the exact same amount of time in similar areas as she did? Would they gather the same types of data, or would they see different things through different eyes and different brains? So that is one of the problems relative to bias in naturalistic observation. We have laboratory observation. It's conducted in a lab or other controlled environment, and that's done. You've seen that, if not yourself, you've certainly seen it in movies, for example, where you have a one-way mirror, and people are observing what's going on through a one-way mirror. Time interval sampling, event sampling. A lot of times, child behavior is observed. For example, the number of aggressive acts that a child or children will do in a particular environment. How many times, let's say, one child goes up to another child and snatches their toy away or something like that. Qualitative research, observation, is open-ended, and the researcher takes extensive field notes. And of course, these notes have to be interpreted and analyzed. So now we're looking at two levels of bias: the bias on the observer's part and the bias on the individual who's trying to interpret and analyze the notes. The so-called complete observer observes from the outside, and then the observer as a participant. This is done quite a bit in education research as well, where people are an observer and go inside the situation and make observations. I'll talk more about this particular type of research at a later date, and in fact, it's part of a grant that I submitted to NIDA a few years ago. So, observation, qualitative research, participant as observer, complete participant, and like I said, the researcher becomes a full participating member of the group. I'll tell you a little more about the grant that I did, but the participant goes into a 12-step meeting and makes certain observations within the meeting as a participant. Now, of course, this raised some ethical concerns about anonymity and the ability to collect data from people who don't know that data is being collected from them. Now, of course, they're still anonymous, but now the question arises, does somebody necessarily have to be informed that data is being collected on them, even though no harm is coming to them? That is an ethical consideration that you might want to consider, and we can discuss next week, and of course, the chapter 4 and the week in which we discuss research ethics. Again, we have to make sure that everyone is well trained. I may have mentioned that this type of research is often used in education and in what's called determining the classroom environment. A lot of times it's done in education. Here's the one-way mirror scenario that I was mentioning to you. Here we have a group therapy going on, and observers are looking at some of the dynamics going on within this group therapy process. Some of the strengths, it allows us to see directly what people do, provides firsthand experience. An observer might see things that escape the awareness of people within the setting. Looking at something from the outside, it gives you a different perspective than looking at it from the inside. And here's a really important issue, I think, and that is that it helps in understanding the importance of contextual factors, because context is indeed that external component that the laboratory controls, but context in the external environment changes. It always changes. So how is cause and effect influenced by context? Again, you can see that some of the other strengths, participants with weak verbal skills, if indeed we're looking at individuals, and it provides, on the last item there, provides a moderate degree of realism when done outside the laboratory. You can look at some of the weaknesses here as well. And one of the major weaknesses, again, with observation is that you have what are called investigator effects. And the investigator effects include not only the bias of the investigator herself or himself, but the interaction between the participants, the observants, and the observer. Another problem, I'm just sort of skipping around here, is data analysis can be very time consuming. So once you gather the data, then the issue is how do you disseminate the data? And this can be quite time consuming because the data has to be interpreted. It has to be interpreted in an unbiased manner. And then the data has to be put in a format that indeed can be analyzed and interpreted. So it can be quite time consuming. So you may not spend the time in one area. You have to, in other words, rob Peter to pay Paul, one way or the other. A lot of researchers get their data and indeed do their dissertations using existing data. This is data that has been archived or left behind. The government has stores and stores of archived data. The Census Department, the Education Department, you can get the military, you can get so much data from secondary sources and analyze that data and actually create marvelous dissertations just from using archived data. I have a student now I'm on his dissertation committee, and he's doing a study on the effects of combat and PTSD and the different levels of intervention that the VA versus non-VA sources provide to returning combat veterans with PTSD. This is all done through pre-collected archive data. Some of the strengths and weaknesses of archive data, and of course the strengths here are many, because you can do all of these things. You can they're useful for corroboration, they're grounded in local settings, you can study trends, it's inexpensive, it's unobtrusive, it's available on a wide variety of topics. Most of the data is already in a format that you can analyze, so there's ease of data analysis. Many times, though, the weakness is the data may be incomplete, so you don't analyze an incomplete set of data. Access may be limited, and that's true. Many times the access to the data is limited. Of course, it doesn't provide insight into participants' personal thinking like, say, an interview would do. But then again, there's a lot of data that does try to capture even personal variables as well. A lot of times this data is dated, or in other words, you may have to analyze data from 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. Depending upon your goals and purpose, this may or may not be an advantage.